178,000 jobs. The expectation was 60,000 folks. The unemployment rate went down to 4.3%. The expectation was 4.4%. We didn't get a loss in manufacturing jobs. We got a hit of 15,000 manufacturing jobs. Private sector jobs, get this, folks, 186,000. 186,000. The estimate was for 70,000. And the average work week, 34.2 hours. That was actually a little bit less than expected. And again, looking at the U6 underemployment rate, that was coming in at 8%.
Wow, what a great Easter weekend present this is. I mean, my God, this is way, way higher than even the range of forecasts. I can't quite figure it out. I have to look deeper into these numbers, but it is really good news for the economy. I think one of the things this tells us is that employers believe that the situation in the Middle East is temporary, and they're planning for the future, and they're hiring workers according to this report. And so it appears that employers and businesses believe that Trump is right, that we'll get the Straits of Hormuz open, that this is a temporary shock to the economy, and that we've got sort of smooth sailing ahead. And by the way, the fact that, again, we're seeing more private sector employment and a fall in the government employment is a very positive thing. It's been a trend we've seen so far. I didn't see what happened with the I'd love to see what happened with the wage rate, but overall, wow, this is an amazing report.
The American economy is not collapsing. That is the first thing to say clearly. If you look only at the broad dashboard numbers, the United States does not look like a country in immediate economic ruin. The Economist's tracker shows 0.7% annualized GDP growth in Q4, 3.0% inflation, 4.3% unemployment, and the S&P 500 up 9.3% since Trump took office. Those are not numbers of collapse. They are numbers of a mixed, still functioning economy. But here is the problem. Dashboard numbers do not tell you everything. They tell you whether the engine is still running. They do not always tell you whether the system is becoming more brittle, less trusted, and more expensive to live under. And that is where Canada comes in. Because if you want to know whether Trump's economic model is doing real damage, you should not just look inside America. You should look at what America's closest ally is starting to do in response. Canada is not talking like a country that sees the United States as a stable anchor anymore. It is talking like a country that now sees the United States as a source of risk. And that is a huge development. Reuters reported in January that Mark Carney is trying to foster a new global trading order less reliant on the United States after Trump's tariffs and broader unpredictability began upending long-standing relationships. Reuters also reported that Canada still sends close to 70% of its exports south of the border, which is exactly why the shift matters. Canada is not moving because the U.S. no longer matters. It is moving because the U.S. matters too much to remain this unstable. That is the first key point. Trump's economy may not be collapsing, but it is changing the behavior of allies in ways that suggest trust is weakening. And trust is an economic asset. It matters in trade, it matters in investment, it matters in supply chains. It matters in diplomacy. It matters in where companies choose to build, hire, and hedge. When that asset weakens, the damage often shows up slowly. Not first in GDP, not first in the stock market, but in behavior. And Canada is now behaving differently. That is why the truth-out-style argument that Trump may be setting up long-term damage even without immediate macro collapse becomes much more plausible when you add the Canada angle. Because Canada is showing you what structural distrust looks like in practice. It looks like diversification. It looks like delayed investment. It looks like defensive planning. It looks like reducing exposure to a partner that still dominates your economy, but no longer feels fully dependable. Reuters reported in a March from Canada's tariff front line that businesses were stalling projects and operations because of U.S. trade deal jitters. Firms were delaying decisions not necessarily because the current tariff hit had already destroyed them, but because they no longer trusted the framework around future access. That is a very important distinction. This is not just about current tariffs. It is about what uncertainty does to forward-looking behavior. That is where Trump's economic model becomes more dangerous than a simple dashboard can capture. Because if businesses and governments start treating the United States not as a secure platform, but as an unstable variable, they begin building around it. And that is exactly what Reuters describes Canada as trying to do. Carney's government is pursuing multiple smaller trade deals, reaching deeper into China, Ecuador, Indonesia, the UAE, and potentially India, the Philippines, Thailand, Mercosur, and Saudi Arabia. Reuters says the ambition is to double Canada's non-US exports over the next decade, even while acknowledging that the US still dominates Canada's trade structure. That is not the behavior of a country that still sees the old North American order as safe. It is the behavior of a country preparing for more volatility. Now, let's be careful. This does not mean Canada has escaped US gravity. It has not. Reuters is very clear that Canada still sends around 2/3 to 70% of its exports to the United States, that many companies are waiting on the outcome of USMCA negotiations, and that deep dependency will not be unwound quickly. So the point is not that Trump has already destroyed the US economy or even already broken the alliance structure. The point is that he may be weakening America's long-term economic centrality in ways that the headline macro numbers do not capture well. Canada helps you see that. Because Canada is not an enemy. It is not a marginal partner. It is not some distant economy Washington can afford to spook casually. It is one of the most integrated, strategically important, and historically reliable economic partners the United States has. And if even Canada is now planning around US unpredictability, that is a signal. A serious one. This is where the comparison between the economist-style framing and the truth-out-style framing becomes useful. The Economist tracker tells us that the US is not in immediate macro collapse. The Canada angle tells you this. Trump's policy style may still be doing real damage by making the US less trusted, less predictable, and less central to the planning of its own allies. And that is exactly the kind of damage that can take years to show up fully. It can mean fewer long-term investments tied tightly to the US, more hedging by allied firms, more pressure for diversification, weaker diplomatic leverage, and a future in which the US is still large, but less automatically central than before. That is not collapse, but it is decline in a narrower, more structural sense. And that is why I think the strongest formulation is this. Trump may not be destroying the US economy in the dramatic sense of immediate breakdown, but Canada suggests he may be making it less trusted, less predictable, and more costly to organize around. That is a real form of damage. And in some ways, it is the more important one. Because an economy can survive weak quarters, inflation swings, and even tariff shocks. What is much harder to recover is the assumption that your country is the stable center everyone builds around. That is the bigger issue. And Canada is one of the clearest places you can see it happening. So here is the real tradeconomics take. The question is not only whether the US economy is collapsing. It clearly is not, at least not in the simple dashboard sense. The deeper question is whether it is becoming harder to trust, harder to organize around, and harder for allies to treat as a stable economic center. That is where Canada matters. Because Canada shows the kind of damage that does not always appear first in GDP or the stock market. It appears in caution, in delayed investment, in diversification, in the quiet decision to build around volatility instead of building around leadership. That is the shift. Not necessarily collapse, but erosion. And once your closest allies start planning for your unpredictability instead of your reliability, the damage is already real, even if the headline numbers still look calm. So here's the question that matters most. If the dashboard still looks stable, but your allies are already restructuring around your volatility, what exactly are the numbers not telling you? If this made sense to you, subscribe, like, share, and click on the notification button to stay tuned.